The soft, golden glow of sunset bathed Cedar Falls as Sarah Mitchell pulled her car into the gravel driveway of her new home. The Victorian-style house stood tall and stoic, its weathered shutters and ornate gables exuding charm, but a closer look revealed an air of neglect, the faded paint peeling from the porch railing, ivy creeping where it shouldn't. Sarah stepped out of her car and breathed in the cool evening air. This was supposed to be her fresh start, a sanctuary after the turbulence of the past year. Her divorce from Tom had been amicable but emotionally draining. Though they had remained friends, their lives had diverged drastically. Now, as Tom worked long hours in the city, Sarah was determined to find her footing again. Here in this old house she had fallen in love with. Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood polish and something older, earthy, almost like damp stone. She moved through the creaky floored hallways, the tall windows letting in the last glimmers of light. Her favorite piece of the house was the antique mirror mounted in the main hallway. Its ornate silver frame was intricately carved with floral patterns, the glass surface slightly warped with age, giving it a whimsical, otherworldly appearance. It felt like it belonged here, rooted to the house as much as the walls and floors. That first evening, Sarah settled in, unpacking boxes and playing her favorite jazz records. The house was quiet, save for the occasional groan of old wood as it adjusted to its new occupant. By nightfall, the peaceful charm had started to unravel into something unsettling. The quiet wasn't comforting anymore. It was oppressive. She paused in front of the hallway mirror, intending to straighten the picture frame next to it. That's when she saw it. Her reflection wasn't moving. Her hand was outstretched toward the frame, but the reflection's hand was still at her side. Her breath hitched. A wave of cold washed over her. She blinked hard, shaking her head. When she looked again, the reflection was normal. She laughed nervously, brushing it off as tiredness. But the moment lingered, gnawing at the edge of her mind. The next morning, Sarah was greeted by her elderly neighbor, Emily, who had come over to introduce herself. Emily, with her kind eyes and faintly trembling hands, peered at Sarah with a peculiar mix of pity and apprehension. "You're brave taking this house," Emily said after some small talk. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her curiosity piqued. Emily hesitated, glancing toward the house as though it might overhear. "The last folks who lived here didn't stay long. Strange things happened." Sarah brushed it off with a polite smile, attributing Emily's words to small-town gossip. Still, as the older woman walked away, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Emily knew more than she let on. That night, as Sarah prepared for bed, she passed the hallway mirror again. She hesitated, her gaze flickering to her reflection. She raised a hand to her face, and the reflection followed in perfect synchrony. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She told herself it was just her imagination. But as she turned away, she thought she saw the faintest flicker of movement out of the corner of her eye. The days that followed did little to ease Sarah's unease. The house had a way of shifting between warm nostalgia and unnerving stillness. By day, sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the walls, and Sarah tried to immerse herself in decorating and settling in. But by night, the house seemed alive in a way that didn't feel inviting. The first true sign that something wasn't right came one quiet evening as Sarah brushed her hair in her bedroom. She caught a glimpse of herself in the vanity mirror, a fleeting moment, but long enough to make her freeze. Her reflection blinked a split second too late. The delay was minuscule, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass as she studied her own eyes, the curve of her lips. Everything seemed fine. But just as she leaned back, her reflection's head tilted slightly to the left, a movement Sarah hadn't made. Her stomach turned cold. She shut her eyes tightly, whispering to herself, "You're overtired, that's all." The house began to betray its age in unsettling ways. At first, it was small things, a flicker in the overhead lights, or a cold draft that seemed to follow Sarah from room to room. But soon the disturbances became impossible to ignore. Doors creaked open on their own, and the sound of soft, almost rhythmic tapping echoed through the walls at night. When she pressed her ear to the wood, the noise stopped. One evening, while washing dishes, Sarah felt an icy chill brush against the back of her neck. She whipped around, expecting to find the kitchen door ajar. It was closed. The chill lingered, raising goosebumps on her skin. Sarah's growing discomfort turned to dread when she began finding her belongings moved ever so slightly. Her keys, which she always left on the kitchen counter, would show up on the coffee table. A mug she left in the sink appeared neatly dried and placed back in the cabinet. It was as if someone or something was living alongside her, rearranging the pieces of her life. The whispers started soon after. They were faint, just below the edge of perception, as though carried by the wind. She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself they were figments of her imagination. But then she heard footsteps, soft, deliberate steps that stopped just outside her bedroom door. Gripping the edge of the covers, she forced herself to call out, "Tom, is that you?" Silence answered. Desperate for some grounding, Sarah paid a visit to Emily, the elderly neighbor. The older woman welcomed her in, serving tea in delicate porcelain cups. But her warmth faded when Sarah brought up the strange occurrences. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Seen what?" "The mirror." Emily's eyes darkened with something akin to fear. "It's been there as long as the house has stood. Every family that's lived there. They all left because of it." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Why, what's wrong with the mirror?" Emily hesitated, then said, "It shows things you don't want to see, things that shouldn't be." Sarah left Emily's house with more questions than answers. Her rational mind insisted it was all superstition, but deep down she knew there was something deeply wrong. That night, the hallway mirror seemed to gleam brighter in the dim light, as though daring her to look into it. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the house and the mirror were watching her. The little oddities had turned into undeniable signs, and the eerie atmosphere pressed on her like a weight she couldn't escape. She was no longer sure if her fear was irrational or if she was glimpsing the edge of something far worse. Sarah's sense of unease had grown into full-blown paranoia. The house no longer felt like a refuge, it was an adversary. Days blurred into nights, each filled with disjointed moments that eroded her grip on reality. She had always prided herself on being logical, grounded, but now she couldn't trust her own senses. Determined to regain control, Sarah began researching the house's history. At first, she found nothing more than dry property records and mundane ownership changes. But as she dug deeper through old town archives and forgotten newspaper clippings, a disturbing pattern emerged. Families who had lived there often left suddenly, abandoning belongings and offering vague reasons. A few accounts hinted at strange incidents, people catching glimpses of things they couldn't explain, of mirrors behaving in ways that defied logic. One article mentioned the tragic disappearance of the Whitaker family in 1978. The family of 4 had vanished without a trace, leaving their house in perfect order. The photograph accompanying the article sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The Whitakers standing stiffly in front of the house, their smiles unnaturally strained. She couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was missing from the picture. Tom's work demands grew, and though he tried to check in when he could, his calls and texts felt distant and perfunctory. "You're overthinking this," he reassured her one evening. "Moving into a new place is always stressful. You just need to settle in." But Sarah didn't feel settled. The house seemed to stretch and shove around her, the creaks and groans of the old wood carrying a sinister undertone. Even when Tom promised to visit, his plans fell through, leaving her alone in the oppressive silence. The loneliness was suffocating, and with each passing day, the house seemed to tighten its grip on her. The mirror became the focal point of Sarah's fears. It seemed to taunt her, its surface catching light in strange ways, the reflection within somehow darker than the room it depicted. One night as she passed by, her reflection lingered half a step behind. She froze, staring at it, willing herself to believe it was a trick of the light. But then the reflection smiled, a slow, deliberate curl of the lips, while Sarah's own face remained frozen in terror. Her sleep became plagued by vivid nightmares. In one, she stood in front of the hallway mirror, her reflection staring back at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Slowly it reached out, pressing its hand against the glass as though it wanted to step through. Sarah woke with a start, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding like a drumbeat. Desperation drove Sarah to seek answers outside her own reasoning. She remembered Emily's cryptic warning and decided to consult a local psychic, Mrs. Thompson, who had a reputation for dealing with unusual cases. Mrs. Thompson was a petite woman with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through Sarah. "The house has a presence," Mrs. Thompson said after a long silence, her hand resting lightly on Sarah's. "But it's tied to the mirror. Whatever you're seeing, it's not just you." Mrs. Thompson performed a small reading, her eyes fluttering shut as she murmured under her breath. When she opened them again, her expression was grave. "The mirror is like a doorway, but it doesn't just let things in, it keeps things trapped." Sarah left the session feeling more disturbed than reassured. Her rational mind warred with the supernatural explanation, but the events she'd experienced were undeniable. She began to wonder if she was losing her grip or if the house and the mirror truly held some dark power. That night, Sarah sat alone in the living room, a glass of wine trembling in her hand. She stared at the flickering flame of a candle, trying to calm herself, but her gaze kept drifting to the hallway where the mirror stood shrouded in shadows. She debated calling Tom, but what could she say? "Hey, honey, I think my reflection is trying to kill me?" It sounded insane even to her. But deep down, she knew the truth. Something was wrong with the mirror, and if she didn't figure out what it wanted, she feared it might destroy her. The tension was palpable now, the line between Sarah's reality and the reflection's influence blurring with each passing moment. The house no longer felt like hers. It felt like a trap. The storm arrived suddenly, casting Cedar Falls into darkness. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rolled through the house like an ominous warning. Sarah stood in the hallway, staring at the antique mirror. She could no longer avoid it. The mirror had become the heart of everything wrong in the house. The strange movements, the misplaced objects, the whispers in the night. The flickering candlelight cast shifting shadows across the walls as Sarah faced the mirror. Her reflection stared back, its expression unnervingly calm, while Sarah's heart thundered in her chest. She clenched her fists, willing herself to speak. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice trembling but firm. The reflection didn't mimic her words. Instead, it tilted its head slowly, almost curiously, as though studying her. Then, in a voice that wasn't hers but sounded eerily close, it whispered, "Help me." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The words weren't spoken aloud. They echoed in her mind, cold and invasive. Lightning flashed, illuminating the hallway, and for a brief moment, the mirror's surface rippled like water. Gathering her courage, Sarah reached out and pressed her palm against the glass. It was cold, far colder than it should have been. As her hand touched it, a vision overwhelmed her. She saw a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children, trapped within the mirror's surface. They banged on the glass, their faces contorted in silent screams, their eyes wide with desperation. Behind them, dark shapes writhed like smoke, looming and oppressive. The vision shifted, and Sarah saw herself standing in the same spot, staring into the mirror. Her reflection wasn't her own, it was someone else entirely. The woman in the mirror mouthed words Sarah couldn't understand, her eyes pleading, her hands pressed against the other side of the glass. The final flash of lightning revealed the truth. The mirror was a portal, a trap for the souls of those who had lived in the house. The Whitakers, the families before them, they hadn't disappeared. They were inside the mirror, their reflections stolen and their lives erased. Sarah stumbled back, her mind racing. The reflection, the one she had feared, wasn't malicious. It had been trying to warn her, to communicate. It wasn't her enemy, it was a victim, just like the others. The air in the house grew heavier, and the whispers became a cacophony. The storm outside intensified, wind howling through the cracks in the old windows. The reflection's lips moved again, mouthing 2 clear words, "Break it." Sarah hesitated. Destroying the mirror felt wrong, as though it would unleash something she couldn't control. But she had no choice. If she didn't act, she risked becoming its next prisoner. She grabbed the iron poker from the fireplace, its weight reassuring in her hands. Her reflection didn't flinch as she raised it, its expression steady and resolute. With a scream, she swung the poker at the mirror. The first blow sent cracks spidering across the surface, distorting the reflection. Another swing and the glass shattered, the pieces falling like jagged raindrops onto the wooden floor. For a moment, there was silence. Then a rush of cold air surged through the hallway, extinguishing the candles. The fragments of the mirror glimmered faintly before dissolving into dust. Sarah fell to her knees, gasping for breath. The oppressive weight in the house lifted, replaced by a stillness that felt peaceful. In that fleeting moment, she thought she saw the figures from her vision, ghostly shapes of the Whitakers and others before them, fading into the shadows, free at last. The reflection, once her tormentor, had been their messenger, trying to guide her to the truth. The storm began to subside, leaving Sarah in the dim glow of dawn. The mirror was gone, the house quiet. But something deep inside her knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning of understanding the house's dark past. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, Sarah sat on the cold wooden floor of the hallway, surrounded by the shards of her shattered reality. Her hands trembled as she sifted through the fine dust that had once been the mirror, searching for any tangible proof of what had transpired. There was nothing, not a fragment, not a hint of the malevolent force that had haunted her. The house was silent now, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. For the first time since she had moved in, the air felt light, almost serene. Yet Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered. The events of the night clung to her like cobwebs, impossible to brush away. Determined to leave the house behind, Sarah packed what little she could fit into her car. She didn't trust herself to spend another night under its roof, even if the eerie phenomena seemed to have stopped. As she locked the front door for the last time, she glanced back one final time. There, in the window above the hallway, she saw a flicker of movement, a reflection, faint and fleeting. It was her own face, but the expression was different. Her reflection smiled at her, soft and knowing, before fading into the shadows. A chill ran down Sarah's spine, but she didn't linger. Whatever had been released from the mirror, she hoped it was finally at peace. As Sarah drove away, the events of the past weeks replayed in her mind. She had faced something she couldn't explain, something that defied all logic. But in doing so, she had found a strength she didn't know she possessed. The house had tried to consume her, but she had resisted, unraveling its dark secrets and freeing the souls trapped within. She couldn't help but wonder, though, had she freed herself, or had she left a part of herself behind in that house? She thought of Tom and their last conversation. Perhaps this experience had given her the clarity she needed, the resolve to move forward and finally let go of the past. But the lingering sense of the supernatural, the idea that the mirror's power might still echo in her life, made her question how much of her had truly escaped. The road stretched ahead, a path to a fresh start. But as the town of Cedar Falls disappeared in her rearview mirror, Sarah couldn't help but glance at her reflection in the car's side mirror. For a moment, her heart stopped. Her reflection was smiling again,